and welcome to the Cap Psych Pod. I'm Kristen Davey, Operations Manager here at Capital Psychological. Today we're joined by Selena Ladouceur. Selena is a registered psychotherapist, qualifying, here at Capital Psychological. Selena received her Master's of Art degree in Counselling and Spirituality from a joint program with the University of Ottawa and St. Paul University. Her therapeutic intention is to focus on working with individuals and families to help them heal and process emotions in a supportive, non-judgmental, safe environment. She typically takes an empathetic approach to treatment, concentrating on theoretic lenses best suited to humanistic, person-centered, and emotion-focused therapy. Today we'll be chatting about something most everyone has experienced or will experience in their lives: grief and loss. Selena, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kristen, for having me and taking the time to share this topic.
No problem. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right in. So many of us have likely heard of the stages of grief. Can you kind of just walk us through them and how you would recommend coping with each stage?
Sure. So I think first it's really important to discuss that, losing someone or losing, it can be a pet, it can be a relative, it can be a loved one. It is never easy to lose someone or experience the grief that's associated with a loss. So it's important to learn how to cope with it and eventually get to a place of being able to accept what has happened. I'd like to start off by sharing a little bit about grief and what some definitions of grief and loss look like and can include. Grief is very much an emotion generated by an experience of loss. It's not really, it's not stable. It's not something that once you reach it, it just stays there. It's something that can change. It's something that can be felt, stronger on specific days. It's a process and one that's never ending. It's continually manifesting. And we can think of grief as a stranger living with us and or as something that can be experienced and then accepted, but not overcome. I think that's really important to kind of state that. So I have a definition of grief. And it states it is the response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or something that has passed away, to which a bond or affection has been formed. Although conventionally focused on the emotional response to the loss, it also has physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions. And that was just, I took a grief workshop. So that was something that was explained to us within that workshop. And I thought it was important to state that. Some other definitions explain it as, there's a grief period, there's a mourning period, a bereavement, and then the grief work. So they kind of break it down. So grief is the natural response to the loss. Mourning is more the extended or the external or public expression of the loss or of the grief. Bereavement is the stage of having suffered it. And the grief work is the work of dealing with the loss. One thing that I think is really important to talk about is the Kubler-Ross model for grief. It's the 5 stages of grief. It describes 5 primary responses to loss. These stages are not a linear process, nor do they require completion. If an individual can retreat backwards at any time, and they can also move forward. So it's back and forth. It's not kind of that one pathway. For example, a person may feel that they fully moved past something, and then the next moment, it can jump right back at them. This occurs because grief is insidious and demands to be felt. So these stages include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So denial is the first stage. In this stage, the reality of the loss is questioned. A person may believe that there was some sort of mistake or mix-up or like an incorrect diagnosis. This is, when they, especially with cancer victims, for example, this is when, they'll try to hold that hope that, oh, maybe it's not as bad as it sounds. Maybe there's a way that we can move with proper treatment. We can, cure it. So it's kind of that stage. They may cling to this false reality and, prefer to kind of stay there. With anger, those who are grieving may begin to cast blame or ask questions like, why me? They may become angry with the deceased person. They left me. In a case of a suicide, they can say, it was selfish of them, and they can turn to that kind of resentment. Bargaining is the next stage. In this stage, the individual will attempt to bargain away to avoid the cause of the grief. So, for example, after receiving a terminal diagnosis, they might plead with God, I will eat healthier, I'll quit smoking, I'll do everything and anything right just so I can get better. The 4th stage is depression. And during this stage, the grieving enters a period of, darkness and sadness. They may lose motivation for living, isolate themselves, and enter the mourning. I'm so sad. Why bother with anything? The next stage would be acceptance. In this stage, they come to accept the loss, although there may still be pain. We like to refer to this as open wounds or raw wounds, raw feelings. During this stage, there's a sense of calmness and a resumption of normal life activities. It's okay. It's going to be okay. Things like that. One thing I also wanted to mention was there's a lot of myths versus reality around grief and loss. So some myths are things like, we only grieve deaths, where in reality, we grieve every loss. Another myth could be, grief is an emotional reaction. Grief is not that. It's actually manifested in many ways. Another myth could be that we should grieve at home. In reality, we cannot control where we grieve. It may hit us in a store, triggered by a memory, those kind of things. It can be, I think, as just to reiterate, it can be physical, spiritual, and emotional, and it can occur at various times and places. And you can kind of think of it like an ebb and flow.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm glad that you mentioned that it doesn't have to just be a death, because I know a lot of people automatically that's where they go when they think of grief and loss, but it can really be like a job or anything, really. The next question I have, how do you recommend helping a friend or family member who might be experiencing a loss?
So mourning a loss, like we had previously kind of said, is not linear. It's something that I would try to help them understand. I would share with them what the stages of grief are and how complicated they can be. And when looking at the task associated with mourning, how it can be observed that they might be revisited many times over before they're able to kind of complete that mourning stage. So I think I would look at it almost in like tasks. So I would say, the first task would be to accept the reality of the loss, or get them to accept the reality of the loss. So oftentimes after a death, survivors struggle to accept the reality of what's happened. They also may deny the significance of the loss, accepting that the reality of the death means that coming to terms with the loss, both emotionally and intellectually, will be necessary. Another thing you could do would be to help them process the grief. So this task would involve confronting emotions, even the painful ones, encouraging them to express it. This means recognizing when they're experiencing the pain, naming the emotion, and learning how to cope with them. Another task could be to adjust to a world without the deceased. So after a loss, many survivors face a world without their loved one. And this can be, where that wound hits you, waking up in the morning and your partner's not there, or going into a bedroom where a loved one used to sleep and they're not there, or seeing a dog bed on the floor that used to, your dog used to sleep, anything like that. Mm-hmm. So this task would involve making internal, external, and sometimes spiritual adjustments to the loss. So for internal adjustments, these are going to change one's identity. Survivors must ask themselves, who am I now without this loved one? External adjustments could include taking on different roles and responsibilities. For example, a spouse who was previously responsible for childcare may now have to seek employment outside of the home to be able to continue living the way that they can. Spiritual adjustments involve changes to a person's worldview, the beliefs and assumptions. So, for example, someone who believes that the world is a fair and kind place may no longer feel this way after the loss, and they may, start to kind of resent everything around them and have that external blame.
Okay.
Task 4, I would say, would be to find a way to remember the deceased while still moving forward in life. So this means keeping a place in your heart for that person that you lost, while being able and willing to move on with your own life. So kind of, how when people always say, like, you carry a piece of me in your heart. Mm-hmm. So it'd be kind of that sentiment, right? Of that person is always there with you. This may also mean allowing yourself to be happy and to love again, which can be sometimes very difficult, especially after, if you've had the same partner for 40 plus years, it's easier for people to say move on than it is to actually move on. So just holding that space for the person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know a lot of the time people feel a lot of guilt with that as well.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So for the 4 types of loss to explain too would be like the anticipatory grief, the delayed grief, disenfranchised or ambiguous grief or loss, and the complicated loss. So to explain these, the anticipatory grief is a grief that experienced in advanced or impending. So this would be, cancer, for example, a cancer patient finding out it's inevitable and that they're going to pass, or, someone who was hit by a car and maybe there's, internal bleeding or et cetera. There's complications due to this injury. There might be that anticipation that could be the outcome. So I think that's the biggest difference there is knowing that it could becoming
Okay.
versus not knowing, versus the sudden. Delayed grief. This emerges if not given time to process an emotion. So it's expressed at a later time than maybe when the loss was experienced. Disenfranchised or ambiguous grief. This type of grief can occur when others do not recognize or honor the loss. These terms can be used interchangeably, and it's surrounding a loss. So it's the reason of the death, or the reason, of the death is unknown.
Okay.
Complicated grief can be debilitating. It can be intense. There could be an intense longing for the deceased. Parental bereavement, risk factors along with support, the support system just not being there anymore. So this grief refers to a grief that is so severe and long lasting that it significantly impedes the person's ability to actually function. To help support someone through a grief too, I think there's a couple of points I can kind of touch on there. I think, acknowledging what they've been through. So validating how they're feeling, supporting them, even using terminology, that sucks. That's horrible. That I can't imagine how much that hurts.
Mm-hmm.
So using, like, making it, you want to offer that solace, but also that comfort of, sitting with them, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's hard. Allowing them time to mourn. So giving them space, and letting them mourn without judgment. There's not a timeline that they have to meet. It's okay to take 20 steps backwards if they need to, just giving them that space to do that. Creating an environment that facilitates openness. So being there, sitting with them, even if it's just in silence. And then, acting normal, keeping things normal, because a lot of the times the worst thing that when someone can do is treat someone differently.
Right.
Because then
like
they
tiptoe around them and
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, check-ins too. How are you doing? Do you need anything? Can I bring you food? Things like that. Just, regular, but check-ins that aren't always considered a check-in, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. And then suggesting professional help, I think, is really important. Losing someone can be, it's incredibly difficult. And there's so many different types of loss. It can be, the loss of a spouse through death. It can be maybe a heart attack or a stroke that has caused changes in the person. There's so many different, ways to lose that connection with someone. So I think being able to reach out for help is something that's really important.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. So obviously, grief and loss is a difficult subject for anyone. But how would you suggest speaking to a child about a loss?
It's a great question. So when a loved one dies, children often do not know how to react to the news in the ways that we as adults do. So their reactions can be very different than ours, and their emotions are not always understandable to them. Emotions are big, and sometimes the children just don't have the ability to kind of recognize or understand what it is that they're feeling. So this can often be due to barriers, like I just kind of said, their age, their maturity, the understanding of what happened, the understanding of what death is, the fact that they have been sheltered from death possibly and never experienced, having never experienced a loss before. So, this can be really difficult too, especially if you think of it in like ways of spirituality. Do they have a belief? Do they believe that the person went to heaven? Can you talk about it in that way? Do they not have that belief? So those, religion and spirituality will definitely kind of come into play there as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think younger children, so like preschool age, they see death as temporary. So sometimes they still believe that it's, reversible and that person can come back. Once a child reaches the age of like 5 to 10, then they start to think more like adults do. So They still have the belief that it will not happen to anyone they know, but when it does happen, they're able to understand the severity of it. They kind of don't have that belief that they can come back anymore. So 3 key things to remember when explaining death to a child. I kind of noted them because I think there's some really important ones here. It's, being honest and encouraging the questions, listening to them, and keeping it age appropriate. I think those are the 3 probably key things to remember when you're explaining this to a child. During your explanation, let the child know that it's okay to ask questions, anything that comes to mind for them. Be open, be supportive, be validating, and then, sharing it in a way that they can understand it. So example, explaining it to a 5-year-old would be very different than explaining it to a 12-year-old.
Right.
So making it age appropriate. I think that's going to be really important. You can also, let the child guide the conversation. How are you feeling? What do you understand about it? Being curious, asking them, what they understand. Children who are having a serious problem with grief can start to show signs, and that's something I think is really important to kind of watch for. So if they have an extended period of depression in which, they lose interest in daily activities or events or things that they, would, engage in previously, that could be a concern. Having, a loss of appetite or change in appetite, change in sleep patterns, a prolonged fear of being alone. They can also become anxiously attached, meaning that they don't want the parent or, the loved one that's left behind to be away from them for long periods or even, at times be out of their sight. Right. That can be something that can cause a lot of stress to them. Acting much younger for an extended period could be another one. Withdrawal from friends, not wanting to do things, not wanting to act out socially, and believing that they're talking to someone or seeing the deceased family member for an extended period of time. That can be something to watch for as well.
Okay.
So one other thing to note is long-term effects of bereavement on children. Children who are bereaved early are more likely to develop psychiatric disorders in later childhood. So this was found from a study by the National Library of Medicine in 1998, and it found that a 5-fold increase in children's psychiatric disorders in bereaved children compared with the general population.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't see like current research, but that was something I read in a study I was reading just about child bereavement. So something else to watch for too is denial of the death or avoidance of the grievance. So, acting like nothing's happened, that can be something that can be concerning as well.
Okay, for sure. So you kind of touched on it a little bit, but grief and depression can often go hand in hand. So what are some signs that someone might be falling into a bout of depression and that they might need some professional help?
So it's a really good question because they definitely go hand in hand, and there's definitely symptomology that kind of overlaps or like co-occurs. So first, I think it's going to be important to kind of let maybe, or let people know symptoms of depression. So if you look at the DSM-5, which is the American Psychiatric Association diagnostic manual for diagnoses, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness are all classed under depression. It diminishes an ability to think or concentrate. It can include indecisiveness. Recurrent thoughts of death can occur. Suicidal ideation without a specific plan, or possibly even a suicide attempt or a plan for committing it. So those are some things to really watch for in depression. Grief is more the reaction to a loss, and it's more that natural sadness that occurs. So, when you're experiencing depression, on the other hand, it has a component of negative self-focus. So guilt or worthlessness, that internal self-negative talk, I guess you could say. And it tends to be accompanied by feelings of apathy and hopelessness. So if a person feels that it's hard to move, get up, motivate themselves, or if they feel that their sadness is persistent or ongoing, never changing, depression is likely the cause. With grief, these moments of moving forward beyond those difficult ones will more ebb and flow. So they'll become less frequent, and they will offer pleasantries with friends and family afterwards. Unfortunately, with depression, it will take away those pleasantries, and This is usually caused because of loss of perspective. So, that indecisiveness kind of comes up there,
Mhm.
or that difficulty concentrating or thinking about anything but the sadness. Depression can sometimes advocate for permanent measures to be taken, as we said before, as classified in the DSM-5. When there's significant emotional pain and wanting to just end that pain, suicidation can occur. So that's something where, if you're talking to someone and you notice these kind of signs and they start talking about, why am I here? Or maybe maybe I don't, maybe it would be better if I wasn't here. That would be a really important time to really encourage that person to seek immediate help before engaging in any type of self-harm behavior.
Okay, that makes sense. So I have one last question for you today. So something that people often talk about is survivor's guilt. Can you kind of just explain what that is?
Yes, survivor's guilt is huge. I actually worked with a client who was grieving a loss, and it wasn't until we hit kind of this connection for her that it was like, wow, that's what I'm feeling. And a lot of people don't know about it. So thank you for asking about it. Survivor's guilt is a particular kind of type of guilt, and it may develop in people who've survived a life-threatening situation or have witnessed a traumatic or catastrophic event. Even someone who has been the caregiver for a loved one with cancer, watching the disintegration of that person, they can go from being kind of who they are to this very fragile state before the impending death. And that can be extremely traumatic to witness, and to go through. Individuals believe that it's unfair that they survived when the other person dies, and this can lead them to thinking that they did not do enough to save the life of that person. So it'll be really important to talk to them about how they're feeling, what they're feeling, and explaining to them that, especially when we're talking about an impending death, there is nothing they can do. So, the fact that they survived doesn't make them the bad person. And I think it's really important when you're discussing that with someone to make that very clear to them, that it's okay that they survived, and that they don't have to feel that guilt for it. So some symptoms of survivor's guilt can include nightmares, difficulty sleeping, flashbacks to the traumatic events. And a lot of the times too, there'll be almost like a suppression of it. So, when these triggering moments happen, it's like reliving it all over again because they've suppressed it, they've tried to forget it. It can also include loss of motivation, irritability, a sense of numbness, and thoughts about the meaning of life. Where they can start to question, what is the meaning? So it's important, during times of that too. If we think back to like Viktor Frankl, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose for you? What's meaning making for you? So it'll be, it's really important to kind of explore what that person's vision is for themselves moving forward. So I think it's important to kind of like when when you were helping a friend go through losing someone, it's also important to talk about how to support someone going through survivor's guilt. And they're much the same, acknowledging what they've been through, allowing time to mourn, being kind and patient, creating an environment that facilitates openness, normalization, checking in, and then of course, suggesting professional help as well. So some coping strategies too for dealing with survivor's guilt can include things like, seeking help, talking to someone, getting that professional kind of perspective. Self-care routine is also considered to be a very important part of emotional healing. And that goes without, for any type of grief or loss, making sure you're taking care of you, you're taking care of yourself. So, grief can lead to both physical and emotional symptoms, as well as spiritual insights and confusion. While grief is a very natural and inevitable part of life, it's also one, for the most part, that can, it can be neglected and misunderstood. Having this experience, it's really important to allow yourself the time to grieve. So, allow yourself to go through that loss, allow yourself to experience the feelings. And then, you get to a place of acceptance. And like we said before, just to reiterate, it's not linear. It's going to be something that's continual. It's going to be, it's a process. It's something that you're going to take 20 steps forward and then 20 steps back, and that's okay. So I think it's really important to say that. I just wanted to say also, thank you, Kristen, for having me. I hope I was able to shed some light on the grief process and what impacts it may cause on the individuals who have lost a loved one. I think it's also important to remember that our job as therapists is to hold space and provide validation and support for our clients as they go through the stages, and ultimately just helping them get back to what an everyday life can look like for them.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for joining. It's definitely, grief isn't something that people tend to talk about very openly. So I think it's definitely important that we kind of just like open the doors to this conversation and get people talking about it, because it definitely can be very helpful.
Absolutely. I have some resources too that I wanted to share. So one of them was the Bereaved Families of Ottawa group. It's a volunteer run group, and it offers drop-in sessions and also sign-up sessions. So you can do smaller groups if you prefer. And it depends on, what your needs are, what your preferences are. They kind of cater to that, which is good. Also, there's another group called Grief Shares. It's a grief recovery support group where you can find help and healing for the hurt of losing the loved one.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. This was definitely very informative, and I'm sure it'll be very helpful.
Perfect. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you again to Selena for joining us today. If anyone is interested in booking an appointment with Selena or any of our other therapists, please head over to www.capitalpsychological.com. Thanks so much for listening.